Well, tonight our goal is to make it through 3 chapters. 1 Samuel chapter 8, 9, and 10. If you want to go ahead and turn, make your way there. We're finally getting to the point that we know we've been working towards this whole time, and that's to have a king in Israel. You remember that as the book began, really when Judges left off, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And even in those dark, wicked days, which we're going to see tonight, they still have impact during Samuel's day and Saul's day. There's still repercussions from sins of previous generations. But even in the midst of all that, the book of Ruth gave us hope that there was a faithful remnant. And at the end of Ruth, it told us that it gave us a little genealogy, and it told us about the coming King David. So we know, we've read our Bibles, we know that's the direction we're going. But tonight we actually are going to meet Israel's first king, Saul. So far in Samuel, we have met Samuel himself and his parents. We've met the wicked priest Eli and his worthless sons, contrasted with Samuel and his mother Hannah. And we saw last time we were together, we saw everything related to the ark and how the Lord is faithful and he will judge his people and he will judge even those who are not part of his people, Israel. He's not bound by geographic boundaries. And so even when the ark was taken into enemy territory, into the Philistines' territory, God was still in charge and he was faithful and he judged the wickedness of the Philistines even during that time, but they're not out of the picture by no means. We're still going to see the Philistines in the book of Samuel. But tonight we begin, remember when we read narrative, we look for these transition marks. We look to see how time passes, and we look to see who the characters are and the narrative, the plot line of the story, just like you would if you were watching a movie or reading a book. Well, if you were watching this, you would understand time has passed because chapter 8, verse 1 begins, when Samuel became old. Now, that's not a dig on Samuel and his age. That's just to let us know time has passed. Because the last time, remember, we've seen him ever since he was born. And then we saw him as an adult ministering there in the what was serving as the temple at that time. But now he has become older. And that's letting us know that some time has passed. But we've been making our way towards this moment of this demand for a king. So when Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel. And the name of the firstborn son was Joel, and the name of his second Abijah. And they were judges in Beersheba. So we understand that time has passed, but not only is just the years passing on, but there's a change in the air. There's a transition coming because Samuel has served as priest and has functioned as a judge, and now he's named his sons to be a judge, but we understand that that's not going to last long. This time of Israel's history of being ruled by judges, that's coming to an end because there's a king on the way. We understand that from just looking at the big picture of the book. But Samuel has taken it upon himself to name his own sons as judges. Now, God had told the people that they could appoint judges. That was back in Deuteronomy 16, verse 18. You will appoint judges. But he never said it had to be hereditary. Now think about the difference in the judges and the priest. We know the priest, all were part of Levi's family. So to be a true priest, you had to be a part of that tribe of Levi. But with the judges, that wasn't necessarily the case. Deuteronomy told them you will or you shall appoint judges. But when we look at that book called Judges, the one that stands out in our mind, it's very clear at the beginning of the book that God is the one who raised up the judges. So even though the people could appoint judges, they needed to be just judges. They needed to be good judges. And so that's what you would expect. But there's a problem. Verse 3 tells us that Samuel's sons did not walk in his ways, but they turned aside after gain. They took bribes and they perverted justice. This is not good, to say the least. Now, he's got 2 sons. One's name's Joel, as we saw. And Joel's name means that Yahweh is God. That's what Joel means. And Abijah means my father is Yahweh. So these are 2 sons of a priest who have godly names, but their lives are not measuring up to their names. Yes, Andrew?
At first I was wondering, the firstborn son, was he like the minor prophet Joel? But like he wasn't that same guy because the minor prophet Joel did not walk in his ways but turned aside after gain.
Right. Exactly. So we know that there's a book of the Bible called Joel, and he was a prophet, but that comes later in Israel's history, and we can know for sure that that's not the same Joel, because this Joel is not a good Joel. But it also lets you know that was a common name at that time. So you've got these two sons, and again, there was no reason that Samuel had to appoint his own sons. He could have appointed anyone that he saw as just. But his two sons, he appoints as judges, but he doesn't put them in the same town as he is. He sends them down to Beersheba, which is kind of all as far south as you could get there in Israel. And in fact, when you look at the book of Judges, Gideon, you're familiar with Gideon, the folks came to him and said, hey, we want you and your sons and your grandsons, we want y'all to rule over us. They wanted Gideon to start this family dynasty. And Gideon said, no, that's not how this works. God is the one who appoints the judges. And so you've got these two of Joel and Abijah, but they are no better than Eli's sons. You remember the difference between Eli and Hannah and their offspring. And so Eli had worthless sons, and Hannah has this good son, Samuel. But even Samuel, he has two sons, and they are worthless. Now, we don't have any reason to think that Samuel himself is like his sons. We saw Eli, he influenced his sons, and there's a lot of things in common between Eli and his own sons. But Samuel, we're going to keep reading over in chapter 12, kind of Samuel's farewell address. It's going to be clear, he's not like his sons. He's not perverting justice. He's not turning aside after gain and taking bribes. But yet clearly this is a failure in some measure on his own part, that his sons have not turned out any better than Eli's sons, because Samuel's sons are bent on gain, and they took bribes, and they perverted justice. And so they are just no good. So there's a problem in the land, and the elders of Israel want to do something about it. So verse 4, they send a delegation, and they gather together, and they come to Samuel at Ramah. And they say to him, look, you're old. Your sons are not walking in your ways. Now, again, they're not necessarily being disrespectful to him. They've appreciated Samuel. He's done lots of good things in his time, but they know that he's not going to be around forever, and his sons are not the way they want to go. And so they're coming to him essentially saying, you failed, Samuel, in this regard, so you need to appoint us a king to judge us like the nations. Your sons are judging us, Samuel, and we don't like that. We're not going to keep them. And so you need to appoint us a king to judge us like the nations. Now, based off of your own Bible study, and perhaps if you had a chance to look at the reading guide I sent out a couple days ago, did you get to look at any cross-references? What do you think about this demand that they're making? Give us a king to judge us like the nations. What do you think of that? Bad idea.
Wrong concept.
Wrong concept.
I wouldn't want one, because I would be thinking okay, to judge us like all nations. You're essentially saying, give us a king so we can end up like the Philistines. Pretty much. Right? No.
Exactly. You're all absolutely right. So we understand when we look at the Old Testament as a whole, there's several places that tell us this, but Leviticus 20 verse 26 says, you shall be holy to me. This is God speaking to Israel. You shall be holy to me, for I, the Lord, am holy, and have separated you from the peoples, from the nations, that you should be mine. So God's people are to be set apart. They're to be different from the nations. And they're saying, look, we want to be like them. We want a king just like the nations. Now, sometimes we wrestle with this chapter. We're familiar with this, of Israel coming and saying that they want a king. And sometimes we have to wrestle and say, well, what was wrong? Was it the fact that they wanted a king, or was it that they wanted a king like the nations? And it seems to be more on the fact that they wanted a king like the nations. That seems to be the biggest problem. Yes, we understand that God is their king, but God himself had at least acknowledged, if not blessed, the fact that there were going to be kings coming from his people. So all the way back to Abraham, God speaking to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, he acknowledged there's going to be kings coming from you. Numbers, Moses was talking to them about when you come into the land. Deuteronomy as well. When you come into the land, and when you say, give us a king like the nations. So then we have that question, is Moses foreshadowing what they're going to do? Or is he blessing the idea that, hey, you will have a king one day? And so it's not necessarily the fact that the idea of having a king is bad, but absolutely the problem of having a king like the nations. That's the big issue. But throw in the fact, if you remember where we left them last time at the end of chapter 7, they had just put up that stone of remembrance. It's got that Hebrew word that we sing when we sing, "Come thou fount of every blessing. Here I raise mine Ebenezer," or Eben Eitzer. That's the stone of remembrance. And when they said, up until now, the Lord has helped us. It was a reminder that God had helped them. He had fought the battle for them. And now, those same people in chapter 7 who'd said, God is our leader, God is fighting our battles for us, now they're saying, we want a king like the nations. And as we've seen so often, not just in Samuel, but in our study of the Bible, how often we quickly forget what God has done and how fickle we can be. Of course, this points us forward to Christ himself, because in Luke 19, the people said, we do not want this man to rule over us. So just as Christ is rejected in the New Testament, we see even now the people are rejecting having God as king. They want a king like the nations. But Samuel hears this. In verse 6 it says, these things displeased Samuel. He didn't like what he was hearing when they said, give us a king to judge us. And perhaps part of it's personal because, hey, he set up his sons. And so maybe he's a little miffed that they didn't want to welcome his sons in being judges. But I think more than that, Samuel being the most perceptive, the most spiritually perceptive person there in Israel. Remember, we've seen that, especially in chapters 2 and 3, that Samuel sees the Lord when there is no vision of the Lord in the land. When the word of the Lord was rare in those days, but then the Lord spoke through Samuel. And the word of Samuel was spread all throughout the land. And so Samuel is the most spiritual among them, and he understands how bad this is, that they're saying, give us a king to judge us like the nations. But we learn something important from Samuel. What does Samuel do to respond to this at the end of verse 6? He prays. He prays. First thing he does is he takes it to the Lord in prayer. And so God speaks. We need to hear what God says on the subject. Verse 7, the Lord said to Samuel, obey or listen or hear the voice of the people in all that they say to you. For they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. According to all the deeds that they have done, from the day I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are also doing to you. Now then, hear or listen or obey their voice. Only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them. When we think about the book of Judges, we keep referring back to that because of its connection here with the beginning of Samuel. If you remember in Judges, there's this cycle that keeps going over and over. It's that the people sin against God, and then they get overtaken by an enemy, and then they repent and they cry out to God, and God raises up a judge and delivers them, and they're faithful for a little while, and then they fall back into sin, and then they get taken over by an enemy, and then they cry out to God in repentance, and God raises up a judge and delivers them, and it just keeps going over and over and over. That's the cycle that you see in the book of Judges. But here, God says, look, there's even more going on. It's not just the book of Judges. Ever since I delivered them out of Egypt, they have been turning aside, forsaking me, and serving other gods. So Samuel, don't take it personally. It's not just you. They have also rejected me. Just like they rejected God in the wilderness, saying, why did you take us out of Egypt? You should have let us die in Egypt. Why did you bring us out? We liked it better back there. We liked it when we had all the leeks and the onions and all this stuff. And God is freeing them, and he's providing their every need, and they're so fickle, and they turn on the Lord. That's exactly what they're doing once again. And so God says, listen, you need to hear what they have to say, do what they tell you to do, obey what they have to say, but first you're going to warn them. It literally says, warning, you shall warn them. So Samuel is going to make it clear, look, this is what's going to happen when you get this king like the nations. So we keep moving. Verse 10, Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking for a king from him. Samuel's remaining faithful. God has called him to be a prophet, to speak the word of the Lord, not to waver from it, but to deliver it exactly as God has said it. And that's what Samuel is going to do. And so here, verses 11 through 18, Samuel is going to tell them, here's what this king is going to be like. Now, if you had a chance to read in advance, is there a word that popped up to you? Is there a word that you noticed? Take. this king like the nations, he's going to take. Well, let's look at some of the things he's going to take. Verse 11 says, hey, this king, he's going to have his entourage. He's going to have an honor guard, his personal servants. Verse 11 says, these will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots. And we're going to see that happen with David's sons later on. This lived out of having people running before the chariot, having chariots and servants there. But not only will the king have personal servants, the nation is going to have their own servants, the military. Verse 12, he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and some to plow his ground, and some to reap his harvest, and to make his implements of war and the equipments of his chariots. Again, to take it literally at what the Hebrew says, he's going to have some to plow his plowing, and he's going to have some to harvest his harvest. The emphasis is on his. It's all going to belong to the king. But don't think that only your sons are going to be impacted by this, Israel. Your daughters will be involved too, because verse 13 says, he will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. Verse 14, he's going to take your land. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his servants. Verse 15, he's going to take a tithe off of your crops. He'll take the 10th of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and to his servants. Verse 16, all of your servants, they're going to be his too. He will take your male servants and female servants and the best of your young men and your donkeys and cattle, and he'll put them to work, his work. Verse 17, he'll take a tithe off of your animals as well. He will take the 10th of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. So we hear in there 6 times this take. This king, like the nations, he's going to take and take and take and take and take. And if you remember back when we saw Eli's sons and we saw how worthless they were, do you remember there was a repetition of that word take? Everything they did in the temple, everything that they did to sin against God, they were takers. And that's exactly what the king is going to do. And not only are they just going to take, but did you notice what kind of stuff? They're going to take the best stuff. They're not taking the leftovers. They're not taking what the elders offer up and volunteer and say, okay, we'll give you this parcel of land over here. No, the king's going to take what he wants to take. Now, I think overall that this is a prophecy of what's going to happen, not necessarily saying that every single king must be this way, but we're going to see it happens a lot. We're going to watch Saul, we're going to watch David, we're going to watch Solomon, and we're going to see that these things are absolutely true. But the conclusion of all that taking at the end of verse 17, what did it say they would be? Slaves. You shall be his slaves. So this king that they want to raise up to deliver them from the nations, to be like the nations and to set them free from their enemies, they're actually going to be his slaves. The person that they want to deliver them will actually oppress them. But it gets worse, because verse 18 says, and in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves. But the Lord will not answer you in that day. Now, if you're one of the elders of Israel, and you hear this, what should your response be? Do you still want a king? No. King is not. Was there anything good in here? There was no give and take. We hear about give and take. There was no give. There's just taking. There's nothing good that's going to come from this. Well, let's see what the elders of Israel, what they say. What do they want to do? Verse 19. But the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel. Now this is ominous for the future of Israel. This is a dark cloud on the horizon. It's going to keep hovering over them for a long time. This is not good that they will not listen to the voice of Samuel, because remember, who is Samuel speaking on behalf of?
God.
He's speaking on behalf of God. So if the people are refusing to obey Samuel, then they're disobeying God. And they say, no, there will be a king over us. And then they give these 3 reasons to make it even more clear. We've seen a little bit of it already. They say, we want a king, verse 20, that we may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. Now, we've discussed it a little already, but what are some problems with what they're saying?
He's going to send their people.
He's going to send their people out to fight the battles?
He's not gonna be there.
Absolutely. We're not going to see Saul as the first king shine against him. What'd you say?
And the Lord's not gonna be with him.
And the Lord's not going to be with them. Absolutely. That's what you're saying, yeah. So they've got kind of three things in there that they say. The first one's that they're going to be like the nations. But as we already saw, God called them out from the nations. They're not supposed to be like the nations. They're supposed to be different from the nations, the one peculiar treasure of God. Secondly, they want a king to judge over them. Well, we've already seen that God raised up the judges. They're looking for this king to judge them, but they don't trust God. They don't like this cycle that you see in Judges where it may be quiet for decades. You may not hear anything for a long time, and then when trouble comes, then God raises up the judge. God was always faithful. He always raised up a judge, even if they were not the most reputable people. When we look at Judges, we automatically think hero. That's what we're taught in Sunday school. But you start reading Judges, there's some sketchy people in there. There's some shady people that God used. We're going to have questions about Saul himself, of how faithful of a man he is. But God was faithful, and he always raised up a judge. But they didn't like that up and down nature of that. They just want consistency. They just want a king. They don't really want to have to trust God. They just want to be able to be on smooth sailing. Hey, we got a king. He'll take care of us. But the third thing is that they want a king to go out before us and fight our battles. But over and over, Joshua and Judges, we see that God is the one who fights their battles. So there's a big problem. The people are refusing to obey the voice of Samuel, refusing to obey God. Verse 21, when Samuel hears all these words, what does he do? He prays. He repeats them in the ears of the Lord. I love the way it says that. What is prayer? But to speak it into the ears of God. He repeats all these things back to God. He says, God, these are your people. What are you going to do about it? Verse 22, and the Lord said to Samuel, obey their voice and make them a king. So Samuel says to the men of Israel, all right, have it your way. Go every man to his own city. So for now, the battle is over. They've wanted a king, and Samuel says, all right, we'll get you a king. And the wheels are in motion. There's no turning back at this point. There will be a king in Israel. So now the question is, who is this king like the nations? But before we get to chapter 9, are there any questions so far about what we've seen here in chapter 8?
When I was talking about like what Saul's gonna take, it said 16, he will take your male servants and female servants and the best of your young men and your donkeys. If he already took all the male servants, who's these young men?
Well, you know what? That is a really good question. And so the Hebrew for young men, we talked about Bible translations last time and how we have a couple of different copies of the Hebrew. An alternate word that may be the right word is cattle. Now, in English, we think young men, cattle, that's a big difference. But it could actually be cattle because it's already talked about the young men. And so because up here earlier in the verse, it's talking about taking your sons and your daughters and all of that. So, and that makes sense with what's going on in the verse because donkeys are followed right after it. So it could be saying that the king is going to take the cattle and donkeys instead of the young men, since the young men have already been discussed.
That makes sense.
All right. Well, you can be done for the night. You've asked your questions. Now, that was a good one.
I have another good question.
All right. What's your other one?
And there's such a big difference in what verse is it? I don't know. Oh, in verse 12, and he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s.
Mm-hmm.
That's a huge difference. Like,
That's it, yeah.
Does that just mean he's gonna have a big army?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, like big troops, small troops, he's gonna have it all.
Mm-hmm. Just like in the regular army today, there's different size groups of troops. All right, well, let's dig into this first man who's going to be the king like the nations. Of course, we know just from being in church, we know that this is Saul. And as we are introduced to him here, let's just keep in mind, Saul is complex. There's going to be lots of questions you have about Saul. I'm not going to answer them all probably ever, but certainly not tonight. We're going to hang on to some of these questions as we keep working through the chapters because we're going to see some things that encourage us about Saul. And we think, well, maybe he's all right. Maybe he's going to do okay. And there's going to be other times that we think, this man doesn't know what's going on. What I want to show you tonight, I didn't realize a lot of this until digging in to study, is there's a lot of warning signs, even here in chapters 9 and 10, that he really doesn't have a clue about what's going on. So we're introduced here in chapter 9, verse 1. It says, "There was a man of Benjamin, whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel, son of Zeror, son of Becherath, son of Aphiah, a Benjaminite, a man of wealth." Now you may remember that kind of sounds like the way the whole book started, with introducing Elkanah. It's just that kind of a formula of saying, hey, here's a new scene, here's a new part of the story. If this were a mini series, this would probably be the next episode. You've made it through Monday nights, and you're at Tuesday night for the mini series. And so we've got the beginning of a new part of the story, and we're introduced to this Benjaminite, somebody from the tribe of Benjamin named Kish. And we understand that Kish is a man of wealth, or a man of strength, a man of might. And so it seems like this family that we're introduced to here is a family of wealth. And it tells us in verse 2 that he, that is Kish, had a son whose name was Saul, a handsome young man. There was not a man among the people of Israel more handsome than he. From his shoulders upward, he was taller than any of the people.
Does that mean he had a really long neck? Like, just his neck and head is taller than
No, it seems like he's a head taller than everybody else. So-
Like David is over me.
Yeah.
That's the old saying.
Like Mr.
Head
David and
shoulders
Mr.
over
Don.
everybody.
Taller than everybody else. Now, you'll have to ask them if they're handsomer than everybody else in the land. But
And don't ask if they'll like that. Say I am.
Well, go ask their wives. Maybe that's a better thing to do. But yeah, so he's taller. We get a big emphasis on his appearance, that he's handsome, that he's young, and that he's tall. So what are we to make out of this? What do you think about first time we meet Saul? It's all about his looks.
He's
About all
looked
he's
up
got.
to.
That's about all he's got. What do you
You know,
think?
I thought about Beverly Hillbillies, a big old boy that's so dumb.
Yeah, Jethro.
Jethro.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's gonna look. That's gonna help him look menacing when he goes mad.
When he goes mad. Yeah. What did you say, Doug? You forgot. I just didn't hear you.
It sounded like he was visible more than other people too, you know. He
Mhm.
was, body.
Yeah. And we know.
Let's say he was looked up to. Excuse me.
Looked up to, there you go, because he was tall. But we understand that that's for men and women, whether we want to admit it or not. We judge a lot on appearances. We can look at history and we can see times where it's like that person got to where they were because of their appearance, not because of their qualifications. Yes.
All except for Abraham Lincoln.
Abraham, he was tall, but not the most
Yeah.
handsome young man in the land. But history tells us that the presidential debate between JFK and Richard Nixon was the first one that was televised, and Nixon didn't want makeup on because he was a man. He didn't want makeup, but that's what you did to be on TV. And so Nixon and Kennedy weren't that much different in age, but Nixon looked a whole lot worse on camera because he didn't get the makeup put on, and he looked like he wasn't having a good night, and JFK looked youthful and vibrant and all that. Well, there's a lot more that goes into it, but that sure helped Kennedy a lot with all of that. And so, did I say all those names right?
I don't think he had a good night anyway.
Yeah. When I got to the end of that story, I thought, I feel like I just said something wrong in there, but none of you corrected me, so I'm gonna trust I got everybody in the right election there.
You kept saying Kennedy and Nixon.
Well, at the end of it, I thought I'd thrown Johnson in there, but he wasn't involved in that. And the bad thing of all this, I'm not editing any of this out. So if Russell and Fred go back and watch this, they're just gonna want to know what's going on here. But so we get this big emphasis on his appearance here and how tall he is. But one thing I had not realized until studying was that my understanding here of the Old Testament is that the only time the height of someone is emphasized is for the enemies of Israel, people outside of the covenant. We're never told about the height of people in Israel, people in God's covenant. You have, of course, Goliath. We know that. We'll get to him. But the Nephilim and the Anakim, those giants that keep popping up from Genesis on through Joshua, and we don't know a lot about who these giants were, but that's the reason we know them, is because they were tall. And so the fact that Saul is mentioned for his height, well, that's strike one. That's not a good sign in his favor at all. But then we get these scenes here, 3 scenes back to back that at first they just seem really strange. I mean, they're common. They're just ordinary things going on in life, and you wonder, why is this in the Bible? What's going on here? Well, first we see here Saul, and he's chasing donkeys. All right? Now, I want you to think back to people you know in the Old Testament that have come before this point. You think about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses. They're all in the Bible recognized as good shepherds. Not just spiritually good shepherds, but like they actually had sheep, and they did a good job of it. They knew how to handle the farm. They did a good job with their animals. But here, the first time we're introduced to Saul, he's lost his donkeys, and he can't find them. And even after searching for a long time, he still can't find them. So let's follow Saul here. It says, now the donkeys of Kish, Saul's father, were lost. And so Kish said to Saul, his son, take one of the young men with you and arise and go out and look for those donkeys. And so he passed through the hill country of Ephraim and passed through the land of Shalishah, but they did not find them. And they passed through the land of Shaalim, but they were not there. And then they passed through the land of Benjamin, but they did not find them. Now, think about the difference in the size of a sheep and a donkey. Donkeys are big. They're not as big as elephants or giraffes, but they're good-sized animals. You should be able to find a donkey, all right? These are your livelihood. Donkeys, I mean, this is prime real estate in the animal market. These are valuable animals. That's why he's searching for them. He can't find them. So the first time we meet Saul here, he's a tall, good-looking, incompetent donkey wrangler. He just can't find them. Well, you keep going in the story, you get the second scene. Verse 5 tells us, when they come to the land of Zuph, Saul said to his servant who was with him, come, let us go back, lest my father cease to care about the donkeys and become anxious about us. Saul says, we need to just give up and go home, or they're going to start sending out a search party for us because we haven't made it back. But the servant has another idea. The servant says, look, there's a man of God in this city, and he is a man who is held in honor. All that he says comes true. So now let us go there. Perhaps he can tell us the way that we should go. Now, there's more warning signs in here that Saul is not the guy. We don't need to be paying any attention to Saul because he doesn't know about Samuel. If I'm understanding the map right, they're only about 5 miles from home. Now, 5 miles in those days you're walking. I understand 5 miles is not the same as 5 miles from here to my house. There's a difference. But it's 5 miles. And Samuel, you remember at the end of chapter 3 and beginning of chapter 4, Samuel, the name of Samuel was known all throughout the land of Israel. He was the most famous of all the judges. Most of the judges, remember we talked about, they were just kind of regional. But Samuel, everybody across the nation knew Samuel. The word of the Lord rang out through Samuel from Dan to Beersheba. That's from north to south. Everybody should have heard of Samuel. But Saul doesn't know who Samuel is. The servant does. The slave does. But Saul doesn't know who he is. More than that, he doesn't see the spiritual need of this at all. He doesn't think, well, maybe we should pray about it. If we're having a hard time, let's pray and ask the Lord to help us. And there's a third warning sign. But Andrew, you had a question?
I was confused at first. It said, so Kish said to Saul his son, take one of the young men with you and arise and go for the donkeys. And until verse 5 or 6, I was wondering, is this like a real young man or did he take a cow with him? But then it made clear his own.
I'm going to let you learn Hebrew and you can work on it. You can figure it out. No. But so Saul hears this and he thinks, okay, well that sounds like a pretty good idea. He listens to the servant, but he says there's one problem. Verse 7, if we go, what can we bring the man? For the bread in our sacks is gone and there's no present to bring the man of God. What do we have? Now, there's times in the Old Testament when we see people take a gift to the prophet or the priest or what, but generally speaking, that wasn't necessary. And so the fact that Saul thinks this wisdom that they're going to get from Samuel has to be bought shows you that he really doesn't have a clue about what's going on. Spiritually, he's blind. You remember how blind Eli got? He got to the point that he had gone completely blind and he was supposed to be the spiritual leader. Well, Saul isn't much better off, even though his eyes work just fine. He doesn't get it. But the servant says, all right, well, here I have with me 1/4 of a shekel of silver, and I will give it to the man of God to tell us our way. Now, verse 9 kind of gives us some historical information. In my Bible, it's got parentheses around it. Formerly in Israel, when a man went to inquire of God, he said, "Come, let us go to the seer, for today's prophet was formerly called a seer." Now, all that's there to do is to give you that information, to let you know that at that time, Samuel would have been called a seer, someone who could see what's ahead. But when we hear that word today, we might think like fortune teller or something like that. And that's not at all what's going on here. And even the compiler of the book, the writer of the book, is letting you know that, hey, time has passed. So that's something we have to keep in mind when we're reading the narrative. This is telling us what happened to Samuel and Saul, but it wasn't written that day or the next week. It was written a couple of generations later. And so the narrator is letting you know that the way we use words or the way they use words a few generations later is not the same as when they were originally used. A good example of this is if you're looking back at the Revolutionary War period and you think about that little song you learned as children, that Yankee Doodle went to town riding on a pony and he stuck a feather in his hat and called it macaroni. All right, we hear macaroni, we think of noodles. But in the 1700s, when they said macaroni, that meant somebody who was high class. And so that was a British song making fun of Americans because Americans didn't have any class in the British eyes. And so the British were saying, look, those folks, they just put a feather in their hat and they think they're being fancy. And that's free. You don't have to do any extra for that. That's extra information. But that's the same idea of saying, look, we're using this word now, but 200 years ago the word was used a different way. So the narrator is saying, look, when you hear the word prophet and seer, those are the same ideas. So Samuel's actually called a prophet, he's called a seer, he's called a judge, he's got lots of titles, but it's all the same thing. All right. So verse 10 says, Saul said to his servant, all right, well said, come, let us go. And so they went to the city where the man of God was. So now they come up, we've got scene 3 here, verse 11. It says, they go up the hill to the city, and there they meet young women coming out to draw water. And that's a clue to us that it's probably at sundown. It's toward the ends of the day. The women usually came out toward the early morning or late evening to go and get the water from the well, which would have been outside of the city. And so they go and they ask and say, hey, is the seer here? And they answered. Now I want you to look. There's a long answer here. Verses 12, it's only 2 verses, 12 and 13, but it takes up several lines in your Bible. The women give a very long response. I think that's because Saul is very clearly confused. Saul doesn't have a clue about what's going on right now. And so they can tell by the look in his face, this man needs help. And so they begin to answer him. They say, yes, he is here. He's just ahead of you. Hurry. He has come just now to the city because the people have a sacrifice today on the high place. And as soon as you enter the city, you will find him before he goes up to the high place to eat. And for the people will not eat till he comes. And since he must bless the sacrifice, afterward those who are invited will eat. Now go up, for you will meet him immediately. That was their big long answer to confused Saul. But all of this is letting us know, hey, the women know what's going on. Saul doesn't know what's going on. But you do have that repetition of the word high place. And I want to point that out to you because if you think about the Old Testament overall, you may hear high place and you think, wait a minute. I know that later on down the road, future kings are going to get in trouble because they didn't tear down the high places. And so the high places come to be in the future a place of idolatry. And even now it could be that the reason they have a high place is because they've learned it from other nations. A high place is simply a built-up altar somewhere that's way up high. Everybody can see what's going on, and it's more associated with pagan practice. And we understand Solomon's going to build a temple. And once that temple is built, all of the sacrifices are to be done there in the temple. But this is before that happens. And so it seems like the fact that Samuel is going up to the high place, that doesn't seem to be a sinful thing. Whereas later on, when you see the kings didn't tear down the high places, that is a sinful thing. So overall, we've got a pretty good judgment of Samuel, that he seems to be a good, godly man. So I wanted to point that out to you just in case you wondered about that. All right, we keep going. Verse 15 says, now the day before Saul came, the Lord had revealed to Samuel. So now we've got this kind of a flashback here because Saul and his servant are outside the city talking to the young women, and now the narrator's letting us know, hey, here's what happened yesterday. The Lord revealed to Samuel, Tomorrow, about this time, I'm going to send to you a man from the land of Benjamin, and you shall anoint him to be prince over my people Israel. And he shall save my people from the hand of the Philistines. For I have seen my people, because their cry has come to me. So all behind this in the background, we've got these three really random scenes of Saul chasing donkeys and not being able to find his donkeys, and then them discussing, well, hey, what if we go over here and talk to the prophet? Maybe he'll help us. And then this conversation with the women. All of these things that we would think are very common. We would think this is normal, ordinary stuff. We must understand that God is working in the background of all of this. God has brought all of this to come together at this particular point in time. The very fact that they show up in town on the day that Samuel's going to be in town. Remember, he's got a circuit. He goes from town to town to town. He's not always going to be in the same place at the same time. They just happen to show up at just the right time, on just the right day, and God has gone before them preparing all of this. So God's already spoken to Samuel and said, look, tomorrow you're going to meet a guy, and I want you to anoint him king. Can you imagine that? Just the fact they haven't had a king yet, and God just says, all right, tomorrow you're going to meet him. Number one, this lets us know Samuel hasn't been looking yet. He's told them they'll get a king, but he hasn't been on the look for a king. Yes?
Didn't it say, like, chapter 3 that, like, word from God was, like, scarce at the time?
It was at that time, yeah.
But it's not now.
No. So at the beginning of chapter 3 it was when Samuel was young, and then when the Lord called Samuel into ministry, the Lord began to speak through Samuel, his prophet. So the word became much more frequent, much more common.
Does it say how, like, how he told, like, God told him, like, he obviously wasn't asleep yet. Like, was it a voice in his head, do you think?
Are you talking about chapter 3 or here in chapter 9?
Here in chapter 9.
It doesn't tell us. It just said the Lord had revealed to him. Yep. And so that's a good reminder for me to, as I often do, that we're not looking for that today. We're not sitting up at night waiting to hear God speak because we have the Bible. God has said everything that he needs to say. And that's a freeing thing. Sometimes people hear that, especially if you come from a tradition that tells you you need to be listening for all these things. You need to be listening for the still small voice. God's going to speak today. Be paying attention to what you see in the clouds. Pay attention to what you see in your toast or in the screen door, all these things. God's speaking through all this stuff. It sounds like I'm a big fuddy-duddy telling you God's not going to do that. But how freeing it is to know that God has spoken, that we have his word, and everything we need from Genesis to Revelation, all that we need for life and godliness is right here in the Bible. So I don't have to wonder if I wake up in the middle of the night and I'm having a bad dream. I don't have to wonder if that's from God. It's not. I can look at his word and know that he has spoken. All right. So God has prepared Saul for this. He's prepared Samuel for this. And so now verse 17, when Samuel saw Saul, their eyes meet. They finally see each other. They meet face to face. The Lord tells Samuel, here's the man of whom I spoke to you. Here it is, he who shall restrain my people. There's a couple of interesting things going on here. Number one, Samuel sees Saul, and Samuel knows exactly what he's looking at because God's told him, this is the one that I want you to appoint king over Israel. But when Saul sees Samuel, he doesn't have a clue. This is the most famous man in Israel, most godly man in Israel, and Saul doesn't have a clue. Doesn't know who he is at all. He's going to ask him in just a moment, say, hey, can you tell me where the seer's house is at? Can you tell me where Samuel's house is? And Samuel says, well, I'm right here. And so he talks to him then. But before we get to that point, there's an interesting phrase that says, here it is, he who shall restrain my people. That's what the ESV that I'm using. I know some of you have different translations. Does yours say govern? Something like here's who will govern my people. Well, that word, just like we have in English, words can have lots of different translations or definitions. And so it could mean restrain, it could mean govern, but it could also mean hold back. It could mean hinder. It could even mean, in some cases, to imprison. In fact, every other time in the Old Testament it's used, it's a negative word. Here it is, he who will restrain my people, govern my people, hold back my people, hinder my people. And Saul's going to do exactly that. God knows exactly what word he's using. Here he is. Here's the king just like the nations. but that's not as good as the people of Israel think it is. Yes, Andrew?
That reminds me of in chapter 8, 17, he will take the tenth of your flocks and you shall be his slave.
Mm-hmm.
Here's the guy who's going to restrain him. Here's the guy that's
Mm-hmm.
going to make you all his slaves.
Here's the guy that's going to do all that taking.
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. So Samuel sees Saul, and Saul sees Samuel, and Saul says, hey, can you tell me where the house of the seer is? He doesn't have a clue what's going on. I want to read or try to paraphrase to you. We understand just how blind Saul is in the situation. He doesn't have a clue what's going on. And we're going to see that played out all throughout Saul's life, because he's not going to understand the true nature of people. He's not going to understand his own son, Jonathan. He's not going to understand David. He's not going to understand Ahimelech. So this quote says, he would misjudge Jonathan to be an unworthy son and a traitor. He would misunderstand or misjudge David to be a treacherous revolutionary. He would misjudge Ahimelech, a co-conspirator against the throne. All of these misreadings of others resulted in tragedy, both for Saul and others. Saul is blind. He's spiritually blind. He does not get it at all. So we keep going, verse 19. Samuel says, well, hey, I'm the guy you're looking for. So go up before me to the high place, for today you're going to eat with me. And in the morning I will let you go, and I will tell you all that is on your mind. Well, at first, Saul might be thinking, well, good, because I really want to know where my donkeys are. But verse 20, Samuel keeps talking and says, listen, as for those donkeys that were lost 3 days ago, don't set your mind on them, for they have been found. So now he's got the answer about the donkeys, but he's waiting a minute. Samuel just said he's going to tell me everything that's on my mind. That's what was on my mind, so what are you going to tell me? So now he's got to be wondering, what does Samuel have to say to him? Well, Samuel keeps talking, and he says, and for whom is all that is in, I can't speak. And for whom is all that is desirable in Israel? Is it not for you and for all your father's house? So now the subject has changed greatly, because Samuel is saying, look, all the things that are good and desirable in Israel, are they not for you and for your father's house? And Saul is thinking, you must have me mixed up with the wrong guy. Yeah. He came to Matt. What in the world is Samuel talking about? I don't think Saul understands yet that he's referring to king. I don't see how he would get king out of that. But he understands that Samuel has some expectation, and he knows that he is not worthy of this, and his family is not worthy of this. He says, am I not a Benjaminite from the least of the tribes of Israel? And is not my clan the humblest of all the clans of the tribe of Benjamin? Why then have you spoken to me this way? What are you talking about, Samuel? Now, this could just be deference. This could just be good manners of saying, oh, no, I understand. I'm from a lowly tribe of Benjamin. This could just be deference. But I think Saul probably understands there's truth in this, that he's from the tribe of Benjamin. And again, we keep going back to the book of Judges. Things didn't turn out well for the tribe of Benjamin in the book of Judges. We don't have time to get into it, and the details are actually quite terrible. But one of the worst sins that you see in the book of Judges, in Judges 19, verses 22 through 26, happened in the tribe of Benjamin. It happened in Gibeah, which we're going to see as Saul's hometown. We have no way of knowing if it was his own people, but he knows his family heritage. He knows his hometown's heritage. And when you go back to Judges 19, it's one of the most horrible scenes of rape and murder in the Bible. It's a terrible, terrible story. And it all happened in his hometown among the tribe of Benjamin. And then that's 19. In chapter 20 of Judges, it tells us that because the rest of Israel was so outraged at what they had done, they covenanted together at Mizpah. We'll see that in just a moment pop up. And they covenanted together and destroyed 25,000 Benjaminites. So it probably was the least of the tribes, because 25,000 of them died because of their sins. And so Saul is saying, look, my clan is the least spiritual clan from the most sin-stained tribe. He doesn't come from good stock, if you want to put it that way. He doesn't come from a good family. Well, we got to keep going. We have this meal here in verses 22 and following. I'm still really not sure that Saul has any clue what's going on at this point, but Samuel is treating him very honorably. All of this with this meal is to treat him with honor. Samuel takes Saul and the servant, and they bring him into the hall and give them a place at the head of those who've been invited, who are about 30 people. And Samuel says to the cook, "Bring the portion I gave you, of which I said to you, put it aside." So Samuel, again, God had told him all this was going to happen, and Samuel has set back the prized piece of meat, the very best piece of meat, which normally would have been left for the priest. That normally would have been Samuel's place. You would only give that to somebody higher than you. And so here he's saying, hey, you are getting this prized piece of meat. And he's honoring Saul even higher than himself. Again, I don't know that Saul understands any of this, but I think it's going above and beyond just being a good host. I think Samuel's doing far more than just being hospitable. So the cook takes the leg and what was on it and sets it before Saul, the leg of meat. And Samuel said, "See, what was kept is set before you. Eat, because it was kept for you until the hour appointed, that you might eat with the guest." So they've been waiting for Saul, and Saul doesn't have any clue who they are and what they're doing there. But Saul eats with Samuel that day, and when they came down from the high place into the city, a bed was spread for Saul on the roof. He lay down to sleep. Now you may not put your guest up on the roof, but in that day that would be the best place to sleep, because that's the air conditioning. That's the breeze that's going to be blowing. That's the best place to sleep. And so Saul is given quarters up there on the roof. And then at the break of dawn, Samuel comes to Saul on the roof and he says, "Up, that I may send you on your way." And so Saul arose, and both he and Samuel went out into the street. And as they were going down to the outskirts of the city, Samuel said to Saul, "Tell the servant to pass on before us. Send him on ahead. When he's passed on, stop here yourself for a while, that I may make known to you the word of God." Now, even somebody as blind as Saul ought to understand, this man says he's about to speak to me what God has said. So things are about to get interesting. Chapter 8, we've seen the demand for a king. And chapter 9, we've found the identity of the king, and we're about to get the anointing of the king. Do you have any questions, comments about chapter 9? All right, well, let's make our way through chapter 10. Then Samuel took a flask of oil and poured it on his head and kissed him and said, "Has not the Lord anointed you to be prince over his people Israel? And you shall reign over the people of the Lord, and you will save them from the hand of their surrounding enemies."
I thought he was going to be king, not prince.
Well, that's a good observation. So the word there, prince, it could be translated leader. I don't know if any of yours says leader. Ruler. So that's kind of a generic term. But prince would be, king would be implied with that, because he does, that part's going to be made clear from later on that he is going to be king. But right now he's simply saying you're going to be ruler or leader over the people of Israel. But this taking of the oil and pouring it out and kissing him, that's, again, in their culture, the kiss would be a sign of honor. And this flask of oil, this is their anointing. And we know it comes to picture the pouring out of the Spirit on somebody when you see that kind of anointing in the Old Testament.